Thank you so much, Dale. And you've got to come back when people are in the room so they can experience your presence in here. So great, thank you. The reading this morning is from Michelle Goldberg, The Mental Health Toll of Trump-Era Politics. It's the New York Times, January 21st, 2022. According to a recent USA Today Suffolk University poll, almost 9 in 10 registered voters believe there's a mental health crisis in the United States. A fifth or more reported losing sleep, being fatigued, or suffering depression because of politics. As many as a quarter of respondents reported self-destructive or compulsive behaviors, including, quote, saying and writing things they later regret, making bad decisions, and ignoring other priorities, end quote. As the political scientist Yana Krupnoff and John Barry Ryan wrote in the New York Times, most Americans, upward of 80 to 85%, don't follow politics. Kevin B. Smith, the chair of the political science department at the University of Nebraska, doesn't dispute this, but he speculates that even those who aren't intensely interested in politics are still affected by the ambient climate of hatred, chaos, and dysfunction. Quote, "What I think is going on is that politics is unavoidable," he said. "It is essentially a permanent part of the background noise of our lives," end quote. Of course, the last thing a political scientist, or for that matter, a liberal columnist, would tell you is that you should totally tune that noise out. It is depressing to live in a dying empire whose sclerotic political institutions have largely ceased to function. This is a collective problem without individual solutions. There's an awful dilemma here. Any way out of the gloom of our current political situation will almost certainly involve more politics, end quote. Well, the mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote, quote, "All of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone," end quote. Pascal was onto something, I think. A recent study at the University of Virginia found that a quarter of women and 2/3 of men chose to subject themselves to an electric shock rather than doing nothing and spending time alone with their thoughts. Now, reflect on that. You don't have to admit it out loud, but what would you do in that study? Spend an hour alone with your thoughts, or take a quick electric shock and get back to your phone? A quarter of the women and 2/3 of the men chose the electrical shock. How comfortable are you with your interior life, what most Americans call their spiritual life? Does a little deep breathing and mindfulness sound enticing, or are those inner voices growing louder and more distracting? After all, we are now at 22 months of pandemic-related stress. The Mayo Clinic lists as pandemic stressors, quote, altered routines, financial pressures, social isolation, and concerns with personal health, end quote. We can all add a few more to that list of stressors. Parents have kids at home. Kids have parents in care facilities. Many of us are delaying our dental and health care. The list of loved ones and friends with COVID grows longer. We all know that if someone gets very ill, the chances are the local hospital will be overwhelmed. And then there's that odd relationship that many of us have with time. Time is speeding up and slowing down at the same time and really confusing things. Fact is, most of us just don't do very well cooped up and isolated. It's a human trait. How affected are you by that ambient climate of hatred, chaos, and dysfunction, as New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg calls it? Studies indicate that in addition to the other COVID stressors, most Americans are concerned about the state of our democracy. Our theme this month is intentionality, and today I want to consider ways we may intentionally calm those worrying inner voices while at the same time staying ready to stand for justice. The reading this morning from op-ed columnist Michelle Goldberg is a bit apocalyptic, I think, but very representative of op-eds these days from both the right and the left, describing the U.S. as, quote, a dying empire whose sclerotic political institutions have largely ceased to function, end quote, is perhaps a bit of an overstatement. Yet there's no doubt that U.S. global influence is in decline, and the pandemic has exposed in sharp relief the deep political and class divides that have always existed in American society, but are often ignorable by many of us. For example, just a bit over a third of Americans have some sort of college degree. That's the highest percentage ever, and at one time a college degree was a ticket into the middle class. Nowadays, however, for many, a college degree means a path into underemployment and crippling debt. And that's the lucky third. Political doomsaying is indeed the ambient noise we hear just now. And I've said this before, democracy is an easy word to say. It sounds nice, but what is it? Too often we latch onto abstractions and even believe desperately in those abstractions without reflecting all that much on what they mean. So let's think about that for a few moments. As with so many words in our English language, tyrant is a Greek word. In ancient Greece, the term was used to describe leaders who took power in some way that was not democratic. Tyrants were leaders usually born into the elite, wealthy class. The word took on its current meaning in 404 before the Common Era, when ancient Sparta defeated Athens and imposed a constitution that was favorable to Sparta. Spartans chose 30 wealthy Athenians as puppet rulers backed up by the Spartan army. These became known to history as the 30 Tyrants. The 30 tyrants instituted a reign of terror that ultimately got so bad that even the middle classes moved out of the city, leaving only wealthy Spartan collaborators behind. Eventually, so many people had been run out of the city, they were able to form an army, and they retook the city. When Eurocentric people pontificate about democracy, we do well to take what they, meaning most of us, say with a grain of salt. The ancient Greek attempts at a form of government called democracy did not go well. Demos in Greek meant common people. What the Greeks discovered is that rule by the common people has at least two very difficult challenges. One, democracy is terribly inefficient and is arguably unworkable when the country is facing a crisis. And two, rule by the majority often takes away the rights of the minority. It was, for example, a legal democratic vote that condemned the philosopher Socrates to execution, though parenthetically, Socrates despised democracy. The Greeks never found a way out of these conundrums except through the periodic rule of tyrants. Now think a moment about our government buildings out there here in the U.S. How many of them are faux Greek or faux Roman architecture? They allude to a democratic past that did not occur. In addition to the buildings, the founders of the U.S. are often depicted as Romans in togas, alluding to the supposed democracy of pre-imperial Rome. The Romans did, for a time, practice representative democracy. That's where we got it from, but as in the case of Greece, that experiment failed. Walking around Rome today, you still see public works with the letters SPQR on them, the Senate and people of Rome. But who were the people? We still use the terms patrician and plebeian roughly as the same way that they used them all those years ago, and it tells us something about how their government worked. The divisions between the rich and poor were absolute. Law even forbade patricians and plebeians from marrying each other. We also do well to remember that something between a quarter and nearly half of the people in ancient Rome and Greece were enslaved. They had no rights whatsoever. Women of whatever class didn't fare that much better. When we talk about democracies and republics, these were the models in the minds of many of the founders of the United States. Ancient Greece and ancient Rome sounded good to them because the Europe of the 1770s was a whole lot worse. As I've mentioned before, the only positive models for government were the practices of Native Americans, but the founders of the U.S. couldn't admit that they were emulating them. Here in the U.S., after the Revolution, a sharp divide very quickly became apparent between those who wished to perpetuate the rule of the professional elite and those who wished to see a broader citizenship, still limited to white men, however. So back to my question, what is it we mean by that abstraction, democracy? Take a quick peek at where so-called democracy has flourished. First, to consider the successful democracies we can name usually have small geographic areas and small populations. Think of Switzerland, think of Costa Rica. The larger ones follow a pattern. Athens during the Athenian Empire period, Rome during the early expansion of that empire, France just before Napoleon, Great Britain during the late Victorian era, the U.S. for a few decades after the Second World War. There is a discernible pattern here. Territorial expansion, abundant natural resources, military dominance, trade dominance, a well-educated professional elite that does the ruling despite the pretenses of democracy. And the empires all rose and fell, and the world didn't end. So, is there a big fix? How do we get out of this ambient noise we're living in? I'm one of those who wants to know the details of what I'm up against, so I'll summarize my assessment. One, democracy as a form of government has never been adequately defined or successfully created in larger nations. We have to face the fact. That doesn't mean it can't be. It only means it hasn't been up to now. But I'm a humanist. I believe that human beings can solve human problems. Second, the presidency of Donald Trump and now the travails of the pandemic have starkly revealed that something on the order of half of Americans don't believe in democracy. They believe in freedom, but that's not the same thing. Democracy, even in the form of a representative republic such as that set up by our U.S. Constitution, requires sacrifice and communal action. Freedom to, as the saying goes, and freedom from, that's not the same thing. That Americans have these two very different notions of what the American project is all about will continue to create stalemate and strife. For some Americans, that government is best which governs least. Yes, it was our very own Thoreau who said that government is best which governs least. For others of us, that government is best when it protects the rights of all of its citizens and contributes to human flourishing. These are incompatible positions. But I'm a humanist. I believe that human beings can solve human problems. A middle position from both sides agrees that some things need to be regulated. What does and does not need regulation is the bone of contention. But it's a start toward compromise. Even utterly incompatible visions do not mean that the two very different visions cannot exist in the same nation. It's a big place. Coexistence, however, requires compromise by both sides. Our challenge and our duty is to speak clearly and loudly what our vision is and why we think our vision is best for everyone. Our challenge and our duty is to state clearly what is not open to compromise. Our challenge and our duty is also a commitment to compromise on those things where we can compromise, because there's no big fix. It's only a commitment to small fixes. We can set our intention on staying mentally and physically healthy even in these days of ambient political noise. The Mayo Clinic offers some advice: limit exposure to news media, make connections, do something for others, focus on positive thoughts, use your moral compass or spiritual life for support, they say. And that's good advice, no doubt. And notice that besides that limited exposure to the news media thing, all of this advice are what congregations are all about: making connections, doing something for others, focusing on positive thoughts, using your moral compass or spiritual life for support. Because yes, even though personally I'm a cynic, and you all know that, I also believe in accentuating the positive, as that World War II era song went. Accentuate the positive. For example, looking to Europe for some projected long-term effects on the global pandemic offers some positive insights. The European Central Bank posits that the pandemic has created a permanent change in remote work and accelerated the digitalization of workplaces, projected to raise productivity levels as it reduces carbon footprints and as it increases time spent with family and with leisure time. The ECB also predicts that the pandemic has made businesses more resilient and more efficient as employers have reimagined ways of meeting consumer needs. Additionally, supply chains have become more resilient, more diversified, and more local, making for jobs and reducing the carbon footprint. Okay, does any of that make you feel a little bit better, I hope? Accentuating the positive. As you already know, there's no big fix to any of this, but there are a lot of little fixes that do add up. Let's start by proving Blaise Pascal wrong. Let's try to learn to sit quietly and intentionally with our thoughts. And listen to Mayo Clinic. Limit that exposure to news media. Make connections. Do something for others. Focus on positive thoughts and use that moral compass. Much is changing, and change is scary. The human condition is that we all enter this movie that we call life when, it's in the middle, isn't it? And the human condition is also that we're all going to be leaving it before the end of the movie. That's what life is about. But the core mission, vision, and values of us, First Unitarian Society, will continue to encourage and facilitate that advice from the Mayo Clinic, because we are a congregational humanist community that takes care of each other and that takes our message of justice and hope to the world. We're humanists, after all, and we believe that human beings can fix human problems. So may it be.